The issue around the southern resident killer whales, as we know them in Saanich, it's Cothalamachin, is an incredibly shocking and desperately sad situation that's playing out in the Salish Sea. We had the issue of a matriarch pushing the body of her dead calf around for almost 3 full weeks. A ceremony, an act that we have not seen play out to this extent in the Salish Sea ever, maybe, certainly not in recent memory. And there are a number of issues that are facing our relatives, the Cothalamachin, the southern resident killer whales, the orcas, and not the least of which is the lack of access to food, their inability to find their food, which is the Chinook salmon. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing an ecosystem-wide collapse, frankly, in the Salish Sea. We're seeing systems that have existed for thousands of years, millennia, in fact, in our riding and in our territory, the Saanich territory. We're seeing that come to an end, or at the very least be drastically impacted by human activity and by climate change. And it's a shocking story, and one which, as the MLA for this riding, I hear about on a regular basis from my constituents, a sense of desperation that we need to be doing more than we are. And I've called on the provincial government, I've called on the federal government, and in fact began to have conversations with governments south of the border, because we share this very sensitive and precious place, and we need to be taking more action than we are.
How could the fish farms be impacting this?
Well, the work that we did throughout the spring session of the legislature around wild salmon was in a broad policy effort, and certainly open net fish farms, open net pen fish farms, or fin fish aquaculture. There's lots of names for it. What people see as fish farms, what people know as fish farms, is certainly having an impact on the broad policy issues that we have to deal with. There are on the fish, and there are broad policy issues, including fish farm policy, aquaculture policy, that we need to get right in our province. I think the argument that is commonly heard is that we are generating revenue and jobs, and oftentimes that is a good enough excuse for us to be polluting the environment, and for the people of British Columbia, the taxpayers of British Columbia, to be assuming all of the costs that are associated with the ongoing pollution in our environment, and as well the impacts that are happening on wild salmon. And so this is an issue which I've been trying to highlight in the legislature. My colleagues have been trying to highlight in the legislature. We've said at the very least we need to move the industry from open net pens in the migratory routes of the Fraser salmon, or just salmon in general, onto land. It's the very least of our actions. It's a way for us to respond to the issues that are being raised by the salmon farming industry around jobs and the economy. But we're seeing the impacts on multiple levels. When I talk to people who were at the very beginning of the fish farm industry, people in the 1980s who basically argued that the reason why we need the fin fish aquaculture industry, the open net fish farms, is to release some pressure on the diminishing wild salmon stocks. I think that narrative took hold, and it was, for about 15 or 20 years, when the industry was in its infancy, that was a good enough excuse. And then in British Columbia in the early 2000s, when the BC Liberal government came into power, they were very clear that they were for private industry, that they were for private enterprise, and that they were going to go all in on wild salmon, or on fish farms, to the detriment of wild salmon. And I think that when it comes right down to it, fish farms are easy. You can create a whole pile of, as they call it, biomass. You can create a whole lot of fish in a very small location, and you don't have to worry about all those creeks, streams, rivers, watersheds. You can log them, you can build mines on them, you can build communities on them. You don't have to worry about the health and well-being of those watersheds like you would if you were focused on wild salmon. So I think that the focus to wild salmon is one in which it's a recommitment to full ecosystem-based management. It's a recommitment to the neighborhoods and the communities and the streams and revitalizing our connection to nature, revitalizing the quality of life in our communities, because we've got vibrant, healthy watersheds in the backyards. And frankly, when it comes to fish farms, you don't have to worry about any of those things. You're creating an economic generator in a very small. It's like a feedlot for cattle, or a large chicken farm where you can create huge amounts of chickens of meat in a very small location, a small footprint, as compared to like a free-range chicken or a ranging ranch. I just recognize that my role as a legislator in the BC legislature is to ensure that the social, economic, and environmental or ecosystem impacts are balanced. And in this case, I see we are accepting an awful lot of the costs being borne out by the people of British Columbia instead of being borne out by an industry. And so that is an issue in which I believe I, as a legislator, need to act on it, and quite simply cannot accept an industry that is so willing to pollute and to hand over those costs to the people of British Columbia, and as well to ignore the benefits that wild salmon have, and not just for our economics, but for our ecosystems and for our cultural values in our province. You know, I've heard an awful lot during my time in the legislature about this is not our responsibility, this is somebody else's, a different jurisdiction's responsibility, and quite frankly, it is frustrating. There are jurisdictional differences. I recognize that. There are certainly things that we can and cannot make decisions on, but I think that we need to focus on what we can make decisions on. And when it comes to the licensing of the location of a fish farm and the licensing of the aquaculture industry, that's federal. But when they are pinning their nets to the floor, the ocean floor, that's the jurisdiction of the provincial government. And when I asked the minister about that, he said, well, they've got licenses from the federal government, they're allowed to operate here. And I said, and my response to that question was, but do we not have a jurisdiction to allow them or to not allow them to attach their nets to the ocean floor? And he said, yes, we do. And I said, so then we do have jurisdiction here. We can make a choice if we choose to not allow them and not allow this industry to do it. So, there's an awful lot of finger pointing in Canada and in British Columbia and the way that our systems of government work. We see that. We've seen that with the feeding of the southern resident killer whales as an example. The Americans on one side of the border are taking actions to feed whales, and as soon as they get to the Canadian border, we've seen reports that activity has to stop and it gets bound up here in a jurisdictional quagmire. These are issues that all levels of government have to take very seriously and have to take action on. I think that there are many things that are impacting salmon on our coast, and I think that it's important that the answer to this question must be wrapped in the context of the fact that we are undergoing right now the visual proof of climate change unlike we've ever seen, the smoky skies. And depending on when you watch this video, you'll think back and remember those 3 to 4 weeks on the south coast. And I know that people in interior British Columbia have been dealing with this for a lot longer, and my heart goes out to the people who are directly impacted by the wildfires. But we are seeing on the south coast, unlike we've ever seen before, the smoky skies. And so this question needs to be wrapped in the context of climate change, because our systems are changing immensely, and I think that anything that we do has to acknowledge the fact that creeks, rivers, and streams in our province are going to need our love and attention. And so, to answer your question more directly, I think what we need to do is we need to reinvest in our watersheds. We need to reinvest in the riparian areas that are so vital to the health and well-being of all of our communities. And as we've been able to draw water from further and further away, our communities have relied less and less on the local watershed. We've turned them into ditches, we've turned them into drainage routes, we've built housing developments on top of them, we've logged them, we've built mines on top of them, we've done almost everything imaginable you can do to the watershed to diminish the value of the watershed. And I think that what we need to do is we need to get back to watershed-based management, ecosystem-wide management. We need to start to view our place in this world as one of many species that deserve to be here and that should be here, and that we are incredibly smart, but yet sometimes we're not that intelligent, and we make decisions that simply cut the feet out from under us. And I think that one of those things that we've done is we've treated our watersheds incredibly poorly. And so while there's an awful lot of focus on the impacts of fish farms on wild salmon, one of the reasons why I and my BC Green colleagues decided to focus on the broader narrative is because there's many, many, many other things and numerous other ministries that we can be doing better to improve the health and well-being of our relatives, the State Nook, the wild salmon.